Here is Van Dieman's Nutmeg, a brown ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. This is very well named as for the color I frequently get. Now there is some tone shift by paper that at times really brings out the slightly red undertones that can be seen in the chromatography. It does tend to shade well, and this lighter brown wears the shading well. It is the non-fountain pen friendly paper that tends to bring out these red undertones, so just be warned. Now, I usually go for browns a little bit more in the umber and sepias, but this is a fun brown that I really enjoyed the soft brown the entire time that I used it. So yes, I would be very happy with a bottle of this, or simply a sample isn't enough, I think, to get all of your enjoyment out of it. The pen for today is a Jinhao 51A with a fine nib. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. We certainly get a nice nutmeg brown here. Now, it's not feathering and it's not spreading. It is shading. And together, that really does make it look very nice as it goes from lighter to darker tones, like on Together on the first line, where the TO are a bit lighter, but during the G, it it darkens up a little bit, lightening into the ET. The H darkens a bit, lightening into the ER. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer. Here is Van Dieman's Devil's Kitchen. Here is Van Dieman's Devil's Black. Here is Van Dieman's Freyanet Aquamarine. Here is Van Dieman's Tasmanian Saffron. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Here we have the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Now, I know that I did say that the cheaper papers bring out the red undertones, but this paper always does especially well with fountain pens, which is the reason I love it so much. Here we get no feather, we get no spread, we get less shading than we had on the Clairfontaines, though you can see it if you look at Windows or Night on the first line, where the downstroke of the D and the S of Windows are a bit darker. Now, Night starts slightly darker at the beginning of the N, lightens up during the N through most of the word until you get to T at the end. That's quite a bit darker again. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. Here we see a tone that has been changed quite a bit by the paper. This certainly to me looks more like a red than a light brown. This paper really brought out those red undertones, meaning this ink to me is a little bit more translucent. Not a big deal, but if you're writing on toned paper like this, know that you're not getting a light brown, you're more getting a light red. It doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. It shades fairly well. I mean, you can see it with like feather on the second line, where the KE of like is a little bit darker than the LI. Feather starts a little bit darker in the F, lightens into the EA. The TH darken quite a bit. The E and beginning of the R get lighter. The end of the R goes to that nice mid-tone that we've seen here. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. I don't think it shades as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. It does it quite a bit more softly. When you look at softly on the first line, where most of this is a lighter tone. Now, when you get to the TL, it darkens just a little bit, but then lightens up again into the Y. Let me tell you, there's not a lot of shading to find here, though it is. When you look at let on the second line, mostly a nice mid-tone. The cross of the T definitely gets darker again. It stands out against the quad rule, I think, here, even though it is a lighter tone. And that's really what's mattering to us on this paper. So even though it's not a dark ink, it stands out on this, so it makes it a very good match. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Three Oysters Doldum. Here is Ackerman Dutch Masters No. 4. Here is Birmingham Pen Company Shady Sight Walnut Street Brown. Here is Bookbinders Eastern Brown Snake. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. Here the tone is slightly lighter and softer than it was on the Clairfontaine, though I think it is holding on to being that nutmeg brown, not a red. It's not feathering, it's not spreading. It does have little areas of shading pillows, if you will, if you look at pillow on the first line, where the P is a little bit darker or the beginning of the P. It lightens during the hoop of the P into the I. First L a little bit darker, second L a little bit lighter. It holds that lighter tone till the end of the W. It stands out, I think, against the quad rule-ish. I don't think this would be a best match. I mean, there's times I see the quad rule with the writing and times I'm not. So while it did okay on the Clairfontaine or on the Rhodia quad rule, I don't think it's doing well on the composition book with the quad rule. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page. Here is Levenger Pinkley. Here is Dieman Dark Forest. Here is Sailor Studio 573. Here is Pilot Namiki Blue Black. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Here, the tone we're getting is just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, though I am seeing more of that reddish undertone coming through here. It's losing a little bit of that nutmeg and becoming just a little bit of some red in there. And it's just more noticeable. It's not the end of the world. There's a slight bit of feather and a slight bit of spread, not really a surprise on this paper. There's not really anything for shading, though you could spot one or two slightly darker areas. I don't think this is a horrible match on this paper. I think if you had to write here, it's serviceable. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding or ghosting, meaning this, although the color's not exactly right, it is a good ink for this paper because you can write on both sides. So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The dry fine of the Jinhao 51A gives a great soft brown with some gentle shading. Now off camera, I tried this in a wet medium and the tone then generally was leaning a bit more red than as a brown, though it still did shade. For this, I say the way to go is dry pens in either a fine or a medium for the best nutmeg tone and a decent amount of shading. It would be a real shame to use a wet pen and make this look much more red, leaving you disappointed with the ink. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.